It was a Tuesday night in November. I was sitting at the tiny laminate kitchen table in my Zone 3 rental flat in London. The radiator in the corner was making a hissing sound, and I could feel a draft coming through the window. I had just turned 32. I was earning £55,000 a year as a marketing manager. By most normal measures, I was doing well. But I felt like a complete failure. Every time I opened social media, another friend was posting a picture holding keys to a front door. I opened my laptop and pulled up a mortgage calculator. I typed in the numbers for a modest 2-bedroom terraced house further out in Zone 4. £500,000. I looked at the deposit required. £80,000. I looked at the monthly payments at a 6% interest rate. £2,700 a month. I stared at the screen. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The math did not make sense. I was paying £1,600 a month in rent. People told me I was throwing money away. They told me renting was a trap. But when I looked at the bank interest alone for the first year of that mortgage, I realized I would be handing the bank £24,000 just for the privilege of borrowing their money. What I did not know at the time was that I was staring at a financial illusion. My name is James, and I spend way too much time obsessing over the invisible math of the UK property market. If you are someone who feels like you are falling behind in life just because you do not own a house yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today, I am not talking about skipping coffees or canceling subscriptions to save up a massive deposit. I want to talk about the hidden cost of homeownership and why renting forever might actually make you richer by a 6-figure margin. And I know it because I have been exactly where you are standing right now. I had spent my entire adult life believing a very specific story. Get a good job. Save a deposit. Buy a house. Get on the property ladder. That was the only acceptable path to wealth in the United Kingdom. Renting was for students and people who could not get their lives together. That is what I told myself. That is what my parents told me. So I saved. I sacrificed holidays. I skipped nights out with friends. I hoarded cash in a savings account, earning barely 1% interest. I was desperate to escape the rental trap. But that night at the kitchen table, something broke in my brain. I started playing with a spreadsheet. Not just a basic mortgage calculator, a full forensic breakdown of what it actually costs to own a home over 25 years. I factored in the unrecoverable costs. The money that vanishes and never comes back. I thought about my rent. Yes, it was going to a landlord, but it was also a maximum cap on my housing costs. If the boiler broke, I made a phone call. If the roof leaked, I sent an email. My financial liability ended when I paid my £1,600 on the first of the month. Then I looked at the homeownership side of the ledger. The property ladder was not a ladder at all. It looked more like a treadmill. A very expensive treadmill designed to extract wealth, not build it. I realized that the British obsession with property was blinding me to actual wealth creation. I was comparing the cost of renting to the fictional profit of owning. I was completely ignoring the real cost of owning. And worse, I was ignoring what my money could do if it was not trapped inside 4 brick walls. I spent the next 3 months pulling apart the numbers. I read through financial reports. I modeled out decades of compound interest. When I finally finished the math, the conclusion was terrifying. The system was designed to keep me poor while making me feel rich. And the first layer of that trap starts the exact moment you try to buy the house. I kept running the numbers on my laptop that night. I could see the money vanishing. I could not articulate exactly how the system was designed to take it. I did not know it had a name until I started really digging into this. I had been calling it the property black hole in my head. Turns out it already had a name. It is called the deposit trap. One night I came across a 2022 working paper from the Bank of England. I was searching for data on lifetime mortgage costs. The paper broke down the true, unrecoverable costs of homeownership over a 25-year period. It looked at what actually happens to your money when you lock it into a house versus keeping it liquid in the market. I used to think that saving a deposit was just a matter of cutting back for a year or two. I thought you just eat out less, skip a holiday, and you have enough for a starter home. Then I found a 2023 report from the Office for National Statistics showing that it now takes the average Londoner earning a median wage over 14 years to save a standard 20% deposit. I read that twice. 14 years of your prime adult life spent hoarding cash in a low-yield account just to buy the right to take on massive debt. That means an entire decade and a half of inflation eating away at your purchasing power while you desperately try to catch a rising property market. At first, I only saw this part, and I thought I understood it. The first layer of the deposit trap is the sheer scale of the initial cash grab. Let me walk through my exact numbers. I had managed to save £40,000 over 7 years. I was earning £55,000 a year. I felt incredibly proud of that savings balance, but the house I was looking at in Zone 4 cost £500,000. Even if I only aimed for a 10% deposit to get my foot in the door, I needed £50,000. I was still short. But the deposit is not the only cash you need. That is the illusion. When I started adding up the entry fees to the property market, my stomach dropped. There was the stamp duty land tax. As a first-time buyer on a £500,000 house, the math was brutal. Even with first-time buyer relief, I was looking at handing over thousands of pounds directly to the government. Then came the conveyancing fees, another £2,000 for a solicitor to handle the paperwork, then the surveyor costs. £800 to have someone tell me the house I was buying might have a damp problem, then the mortgage arrangement fee. Often another £1,000 just for the bank to set up the loan. I added it all up. To buy that house, I did not just need £50,000. I needed almost 10,000 extra pounds in pure sunk costs just to get the keys. That is money that immediately disappears the second the ink dries on the contract. It does not go into the house. It does not build your personal equity. It just evaporates into the ecosystem of the property market. I looked at my hard-earned savings. If I bought that house, I would instantly lose 20% of my net worth to fees. But as I kept reading through the Bank of England paper, I realized the entry fees were actually the cheapest part of the transaction, because once you sign the paperwork, the real financial bleed begins. I used to sit at my desk at work and listen to people talk about their houses. My colleague Mark sat right across from me. He was 34 years old. He was earning £60,000 a year. He had just bought a 3-bedroom house in Kent for £450,000. He brought a box of pastries into the office to celebrate getting the keys. He stood by my desk and told me he was relieved to finally stop paying another man's mortgage. He told me he was finally building real wealth. He asked me when I was going to stop throwing my money away on rent. I smiled and congratulated him. But that night, I went home and ran Mark's exact numbers through my spreadsheet. I wanted to see this wealth creation in action. Mark told me he put down a £45,000 deposit. He said his monthly mortgage payment was £2,400. Let us look at the actual math of what Mark did. When you buy a house, you immediately incur unrecoverable costs. These are costs that do not build equity. You never get this money back. Rent is an unrecoverable cost. But home buyers have them too. Mark paid a £5,000 stamp duty bill. He paid £2,000 to his solicitor for the conveyancing. He paid £1,500 in mortgage arrangement fees and surveys. That is £8,500 gone on day one. Poof. Vanished. Now let us look at his first 12 months of living in that house. His mortgage is £2,400 a month. But here is the secret of the amortization schedule. In year one of a 25-year mortgage at a roughly 6% interest rate, almost £2,000 of that monthly payment is pure interest. The bank takes it as profit. Only £400 actually goes toward paying down the house. Over 12 months, Mark pays £28,800 out of his bank account. Out of that massive number, £24,000 is just interest. The bank keeps it. Add his £8,500 in moving fees. In his first year of homeownership, Mark burned £32,500 in unrecoverable costs. That money is gone forever. It is exactly the same as paying rent to a bank. Meanwhile, I was paying £1,600 a month to rent my flat in Zone 3. Over 12 months, my unrecoverable cost was £19,200. I was throwing away £19,200. Mark was throwing away £32,500. He was burning £13,300 more than me in a single year. But society was calling him a responsible adult and calling me a financial failure. The math proved the exact opposite. Mark was essentially renting money from the bank, and the bank was charging him a massive premium for the privilege. I looked at those numbers on my screen and felt a massive weight lift off my chest. I was not falling behind. I was mathematically ahead. But when I dug deeper into the life cycle of a mortgage, I found something that most people never notice. The interest and the entry fees were just the surface. The trap goes much deeper than year one. But when I dug deeper, I found something that most people never notice. I had always assumed a mortgage was a straight line. You borrow money, you make a payment, and your debt goes down by that exact amount. I thought that if I paid £2,400 a month, my house was suddenly £2,400 more mine. I pulled up a full 25-year amortization schedule on my laptop. I stared at the columns of numbers. An amortization schedule is the exact mathematical map of how a loan is paid off over time, and it is entirely rigged in favor of the bank. I stretched my colleague Mark's mortgage out over the first 10 years. He had borrowed £405,000. He was diligently paying his £2,400 every single month. Over 10 years, he will transfer £288,000 from his bank account to his lender. I looked at the column showing his remaining debt. I expected his balance to be drastically lower. It was not. After a decade of making those massive payments, out of that £288,000, an astonishing £215,000 went straight to the bank as pure interest. Only £73,000 actually chipped away at the money he borrowed. After 10 straight years of homeownership, after sacrificing a massive chunk of his monthly salary, Mark would still owe the bank £332,000. He had barely made a dent in his actual debt. I used to think that when you buy a house, the bank just charges a modest fee for the service of lending you cash. I assumed it was a fair and balanced trade. Then, I found a 2024 housing market report from the Resolution Foundation showing that on a typical 25-year mortgage at 6%, borrowers will often pay more in total lifetime interest than the original purchase price of the property itself. I read that twice. The total interest is higher than the price of the house. People talk about the property market like it is a wealth creation machine for the middle class. But this data showed exactly what it really is. It is a wealth extraction machine for the financial sector. If you buy a £500,000 house with a £50,000 deposit, you are not paying £500,000. By the end of the 25 years, factoring in the interest, you are paying closer to £950,000 for those same four walls. The bank is literally making you buy the house twice. You buy the bricks for yourself, and you buy an invisible replica of the house entirely for the bank. And the bank always takes their house first. That is what the amortization schedule guarantees. They front-load the interest so heavily that if you decide to sell and move after 5 or 7 years, which most young professionals do, you have built almost zero actual equity. You simply clear the massive interest hurdle for the bank, sell the property, and start the exact same rigged game all over again at the bottom of a new amortization schedule. I sat back in my chair. The radiator in my rented flat was still hissing. I realized that people who mock renters for paying someone else's mortgage are entirely missing the point. When you have a mortgage, you are just renting money, and the bank is the most ruthless landlord on the planet. But even with the interest payments mathematically bleeding you dry, at least you have a physical asset. At least you own the roof over your head and control your own environment. And this is the part that took me years to figure out. The part nobody tells you about the physical reality of owning bricks in the United Kingdom. This is the version of the trap I never heard anyone talk about, the one that took me years to find. When people talk about buying property, they talk about the house like it is a solid gold bar. You buy it, you put it in a vault, and it slowly becomes more valuable over time. But a house is not a gold bar. It is a wooden, brick, and glass box sitting outside in the wind and the rain. It rots. It rusts. It breaks. I used to think that once I bought a house, my monthly costs were fixed forever. Rent goes up, but a mortgage stays the same. That is the great British myth. Then I found a 2024 report from Checkatrade analyzing home repair costs. It showed that the average UK homeowner spends over £3,000 a year just on basic upkeep, not including major structural repairs. I read that twice. £3,000 a year, just to keep the house from falling apart. If your boiler dies in January, that is £3,000 gone in a single day. If your roof leaks, that is £5,000. When I rented my flat, a broken boiler was my landlord's financial disaster. I just put on a thick jumper and waited for the repair guy. My bank account stayed exactly the same. If I owned the property, every single broken pipe, cracked tile, and damp patch was my direct financial responsibility. I started factoring the 1% rule into my spreadsheet. The golden rule of real estate says you must expect to spend 1% of the property value every single year on maintenance. On a £500,000 house, that is £5,000 every year. Over a 10-year period, that is £50,000. That is £50,000 quietly drained from the supposed profit of the house. You do not get that money back when you sell. You just get to tell the buyer that the roof currently does not leak. And if you buy a flat in London instead of a house, the trap gets even more aggressive. You are dealing with the leasehold system. My friend Sarah bought a 2-bedroom flat in South London. She was thrilled. She told me she was finally on the ladder. When she moved in, her service charge to the building management company was £1,500 a year. 3 years later, they found a structural issue in the building. Her share of the repair bill was £10,000. The next year, her annual service charge was increased to £4,000. She had absolutely no control over it. She could not shop around for a better deal. She was legally obligated to pay whatever the management company demanded. She was trapped in her own home. Then I added the required insurances. When you rent, you buy cheap contents insurance for maybe £10 a month. When you have a mortgage, the bank legally forces you to buy comprehensive building insurance. That is another £40 a month. They heavily push life insurance to cover the debt. Another £30 a month. Over 25 years, those insurances alone cost £21,000. But the maintenance and the fees are only half the tragedy. The real destruction happens when you calculate the opportunity cost. I looked at that £50,000 I would spend on maintenance over 10 years. If I was renting, I would not be buying new boilers or fixing damp walls. I could take that exact same £5,000 a year and put it straight into a global index fund. If I invested that maintenance money at an 8% average annual return, over 25 years, it would compound into nearly £400,000. Let me say that again so the math really lands. By putting your money into a new roof and a fixed boiler instead of the stock market, you are not just losing the cash. You are losing the massive compound growth that money would have earned you over the life of your mortgage. You are literally paying a fortune just to keep the rain out while telling yourself you are getting rich. And that is when the true weight of the situation hit me. The house was not an asset. It was a massive, hungry liability that required constant feeding, and I was standing right at the edge of the trap. I took a deep breath and opened a blank tab on my spreadsheet. I wanted to see the final score. I wanted to put the two paths side by side over a 25-year lifetime. Path 1 was the Great British Dream. I buy the £500,000 house. Path 2 was the financial outcast. I rent forever and invest the difference. Let us look at Path 1. I hand over my £80,000 deposit. I pay my stamp duty and my solicitor fees. My monthly mortgage payment is £2,700. I add £400 a month for basic maintenance. I add £70 for building and life insurance. My total true cost of owning that house is £3,170 every single month. Fast forward 25 years, I have diligently paid off the mortgage. I own the house outright. Historically, UK property has grown by around 3 to 4% a year. So after 2.5 decades, my £500,000 house is worth roughly £1.2 million. I am a property millionaire on paper, but all my cash is trapped in a pile of bricks. Now I looked at Path 2. I stay in my rented flat. My rent is £1,600 a month. That means I have £1,570 left over every single month compared to the homeowner path. I take my £80,000 deposit and put it straight into a low-cost global index fund. I never touch it. Then, every single month for 25 years, I take that extra £1,570 and I invest it in the exact same fund. I assume a historical average market return of 8% a year. I looked at the 10-year mark first. At year 10, the homeowner is drowning in bank interest and fixing the boiler. Their house has gone up in value, but they only own a tiny fraction of it. My portfolio at year 10 was already crossing £450,000 in liquid cash. At year 20, the exponential growth curve takes over. The homeowner is finally starting to pay down the actual principal of their loan. But my stock portfolio is now generating more in annual returns than I earn at my day job. Then, I hit enter on the final 25-year calculation. The number that popped up on the screen made my jaw drop. After 25 years, my investment portfolio would be worth just over £2 million. I stared at the two numbers side by side. £1.2 million in an illiquid house that constantly needs repairs, or £2 million in completely liquid stocks that pay me cash dividends while I sleep. The gap between the two paths was massive. Renting and investing made me richer by £800,000. I ran the numbers again. I thought I had made a huge mistake. I added rent increases to the spreadsheet. Even if my rent went up by 3% every single year, I still came out hundreds of thousands of pounds ahead. Because compound interest in the stock market accelerates faster than property appreciation. A house only grows based on its total value. A stock portfolio grows on its base value, plus the dividends you reinvest, compounding on top of itself in a relentless upward curve. If I chose the house, I was choosing to be poorer by a massive six-figure margin. I was choosing to trap my entire net worth in a single asset in a single postcode. I closed my laptop. The radiator in my rented flat was still hissing. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like a failure for living there. I had the math right in front of me. Renting was mathematically superior. But the next morning, when I walked into the office and saw my colleague Mark talking about his new garden, the familiar feeling of failure came rushing right back. That was when I finally understood why I kept getting stuck, even when I knew the right answer. I walked into the office the next morning. Mark was standing by the coffee machine showing pictures of his new back garden. Everyone was crowded around him. They were congratulating him again. I had the spreadsheet burned into my memory. I knew I was mathematically on a path to £800,000 more wealth. But standing there holding my plastic coffee cup, I felt completely inadequate. That was when I finally understood why the deposit trap is so hard to escape even when you know it exists. The math is clear, but the psychology is completely rigged. In the United Kingdom, we do not treat housing as just shelter. We treat it as a moral victory. We treat it as the ultimate test of adulthood. If you own a house, you are a serious person. If you rent, you are a transient. You are temporary. You have not figured your life out yet. The entire financial system knows this. They do not just sell you a mortgage. They sell you the feeling of finally arriving. I used to spend my lunch breaks scrolling through property websites. I would look at houses I could barely afford. I would imagine arranging the furniture. It gave me a cheap dopamine hit. It made me feel like I was taking real action in my life. I went to my parents' house for a Sunday roast that same weekend. I was sitting at the dining table. My dad looked at me and asked how the house hunting was going. I told him I had decided to keep renting and put my deposit into the stock market instead. The room went completely silent. My mother looked at me with genuine pity. My dad sighed. He told me the stock market is just gambling. He told me property is safe. He told me I needed to grow up and put down roots. He told me I was making a massive mistake. That look of pity on his face is the exact psychological lever the banking industry uses to pull young professionals into massive debt. We are terrified of being left behind by our peers. We are terrified of disappointing our parents. So we blindly hand over £80,000 and lock ourselves into 25 years of unrecoverable interest payments just to buy the social approval of the people around us. I realize the banks do not even need to advertise the financial benefits of a mortgage anymore. Society does the marketing for them. The pressure at the office, the questions at dinner parties, the subtle judgment from family members, it all pushes you toward the bank branch. I got played by this system for years. I let my ego dictate my financial goals. I had to train my brain to separate my net worth from my self-worth. I had to learn how to smile and nod when people told me I was throwing my rent money away, knowing full well my index funds were compounding quietly in the background. But even as I started to feel more confident in my decision, there was one nagging fear that kept keeping me awake at night. The ultimate nightmare scenario that everyone throws in your face when you say you are going to rent forever. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now, because it used to form in mine. I know exactly what you are thinking right now. I pushed back against this idea for years. I thought the exact same thing when I first looked at my own spreadsheet. What happens when I am 70 years old? What happens when I retire, and I still have to pay rent every single month? I used to think that paying off a mortgage by age 65 was the only way to survive retirement. The idea of being a pensioner and handing over a massive chunk of my fixed income to a landlord terrified me. I pictured myself getting evicted at 80 years old. It felt incredibly reckless to rent forever. I thought a paid-off house was the ultimate safety net. Then I found a 1,998 study from Trinity University, commonly known in financial circles as the Trinity Study. It analyzed stock market data over decades to find a safe withdrawal rate for retirees. The study proved that if you have a diversified portfolio of index funds, you can safely withdraw 4% of its value every single year, adjust it for inflation, and essentially never run out of money over a 30-year retirement. I took that 4% rule and applied it to my own math. I went back to the £2 million portfolio I would build by renting and investing the difference over 25 years. 4% of £2 million is £80,000 a year in purely passive income. I ran the worst-case scenario. Even if my rent had aggressively doubled over those 25 years to £3,200 a month, my yearly housing cost would be roughly £38,000. My portfolio would be paying me £80,000 a year. I could easily pay my massive inflated rent, still have over £40,000 left over every single year for living expenses, and my initial £2 million principal would remain untouched, still compounding in the background. And that is the counterintuitive truth that completely separates this strategy from standard financial advice. Liquidity and compound growth offer infinitely more security than bricks and mortar. Think about the homeowner at age 70. They have a paid-off house worth £1.2 million, but they have almost no cash. They are cash poor and asset rich. They still have to pay council tax. They still have to fix the roof when it inevitably leaks. They still have to heat a house that is probably too big for them. If they need cash for medical care or they just want to travel and enjoy their retirement, they have to sell the house. Or worse, they have to take out an equity release loan, putting them right back into debt with the exact same bank they just spent 25 years paying off. I realize that owning a home does not make you financially free. It just traps your wealth in a very illiquid box. By choosing to rent and invest, my wealth would be completely liquid. I could move to a cheaper city. I could move to a different country. I had total control over my money, but understanding the math in a spreadsheet is very different from actually living it. To make this work, I could not just save casually. I had to build a rigid system that forced me to build wealth, exactly like a bank forces you to pay a mortgage. I sat there at my kitchen table looking at that £80,000 passive income projection. The math was completely undeniable. But I knew that understanding the spreadsheet was not enough to save me. I had to actually execute the plan. I had to build a system that made the math a reality. The first thing I did was completely reframe my relationship with rent. I had to break the psychological conditioning that told me renting was a failure. I stopped looking at my £1,600 a month as wasted money. I started viewing it as the maximum fixed price I was paying for ultimate flexibility and zero maintenance risk. I went into my banking app. I physically renamed the rent category. I called it my Freedom Premium. It sounds small, but it completely changed how I felt when the money left my account on the first of every month. I was not throwing money away. I was buying a service. The second step I took was treating my stock portfolio exactly like a mandatory mortgage payment. This is where the actual wealth transfer happened. I knew that if I bought that house, the bank would force me to pay them every single month. They would not accept excuses. I had to be just as ruthless with myself. I did not just invest whatever was left over at the end of the month. I looked at the exact difference between renting and owning. I knew the mortgage, the basic maintenance, and the insurance on that Zone 4 house would have cost me £3,170 a month. My rent was £1,600. That left a gap of £1,570. I set up an automated direct debit for that exact amount. £1,570 automatically left my checking account 2 days after my paycheck cleared. It went straight into a low-cost global index fund. I never saw the money. I forced myself to live exactly as if I had bought that house. But instead of paying a massive interest premium to a bank, I was paying my future self. The results were immediate and massive. Within the first 12 months, I watched my initial £80,000 deposit start to generate its own gravity. With my monthly contributions and the market returns, my liquid net worth crossed £100,000 for the very first time in my life. I remember standing in my kitchen when the email arrived telling me my rent was going up by £50 a month. I did not panic. I opened my brokerage account and saw that my investments had grown by over £6,000 in that same year. The rent increase was mathematically irrelevant. I did not have to fix a broken roof. I did not have to stress about the Bank of England raising interest rates. I just watched my numbers quietly compound. The deep background stress I had carried for years about getting on the property ladder just completely vanished. But automating the investments was only the defensive part of the strategy. To truly accelerate my path to real wealth, I had to leverage the one massive advantage renters have over homeowners. I had to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. The third step I took was leveraging my geographic mobility to aggressively increase my income. When you buy a house, you anchor your entire career to a 30-mile radius, you are completely stuck. Your employer knows you are stuck, you lose your leverage. I was earning £55,000 a year. 18 months into my renting and investing strategy, a recruiter contacted me. They offered me a senior marketing role based in Manchester. The starting salary was £70,000. If I had bought that £500,000 house in Zone 4, I would have been trapped. I would have had to reject the offer, or I would have had to spend thousands of pounds and hundreds of hours commuting, or I would have had to sell the house, pay another £5,000 in estate agent fees, and lose all my original unrecoverable entry costs. Because I rented, I had ultimate flexibility. I simply handed my landlord my 30 days notice. I packed my boxes. I moved to a nicer flat in Manchester that actually cost £200 less in monthly rent. My income instantly jumped by £15,000 a year. My living costs went down. I took that entire £15,000 raise and funneled it straight into my global index funds. My wealth acceleration went into absolute overdrive. I was no longer just matching the monthly cost of a London mortgage. I was beating it by a massive margin. I was buying my freedom every single month. Let us look back at the lifetime math one final time. If I had followed the traditional British path, I would have spent 25 years terrified of the Bank of England changing interest rates. I would have spent my weekends fixing broken gutters and painting damp walls. I would have handed a massive retail bank hundreds of thousands of pounds in pure interest. After 2.5 decades, I would have a house worth £1.2 million. But I would have almost zero liquid cash to actually live my life. By choosing to step out of the deposit trap, my trajectory changed completely. By automating my investments and using my geographic mobility to force my income higher, my spreadsheet proved a totally different reality. After 25 years, my portfolio would cross £2 million in entirely liquid assets. I would not just be richer by £800,000, I would be completely free. And that is the core emotional truth underneath all of this math. We are culturally conditioned to believe that a house is the ultimate symbol of security, but debt is not secure. A massive mortgage hanging over your head for 25 years is the exact opposite of security. It is a leash. Real security is having a growing pile of liquid cash that can pay your rent whether you decide to work or not. Real security is the ability to walk away from a toxic boss because you do not have a massive bank payment due on the first of the month. I stopped wanting a house the exact moment I realized I actually just wanted freedom. The property ladder is just a treadmill in disguise. Once I stepped off it, my real wealth finally started to grow. If this video helped you see your finances differently, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe. Every video I make is something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.